Let me ask you a simple question. If you discovered a land that had almost everything you needed to survive, to grow, to dominate the future, would you help that land become strong, or would you make sure it never could? This is not a story about villains and heroes. This is a story about incentives, about fear, about power, and once you see it clearly, history starts to make uncomfortable sense. Before Africa became a target, Europe was unstable, fragmented kingdoms, constant wars, limited land, limited resources. Europe didn't have endless gold. It didn't have massive fertile zones untouched by war. It didn't have the scale needed to grow without expansion, but it did have one thing: pressure. Pressure to survive, pressure to compete, pressure to outgrow its neighbors or be swallowed by them. So Europe looked outward, and eventually it looked south. Africa wasn't empty, it wasn't primitive, it wasn't waiting to be discovered. It had gold before Europe understood banking, trade routes before Europe mastered navigation, empires before Europe stabilized borders, and most importantly, Africa had options: land, resources, self-sufficiency, which meant something dangerous. Africa didn't need Europe, and that's where the tension starts. At first, everything looks reasonable: trade, exchanges, smiles and agreements. Europe arrives carefully, respectfully, almost humbly, not because it was moral, but because it was cautious. You don't kick down the door of someone who could become your equal. So, collaboration begins. But here's the part most people miss. From the very beginning, there was a limit. Europe was fine with Africa trading, fine with Africa producing, fine with Africa supplying, but there was one thing Europe could never allow: Africa becoming independent of Europe, because once Africa could process its own resources, defend its own trade routes, build its own industrial system, the relationship flips. Africa stops being a supplier and becomes a competitor. Borders drawn without consent, economies redesigned for extraction, growth redirected outward. Africa is no longer allowed to rise naturally, not because it couldn't, but because it mustn't. And this is why every peaceful partnership eventually cracks, not immediately, not loudly, but inevitably. The consequences weren't just political, they were psychological, economic, generational. A continent rich in resources, forced into dependency, not by lack, but by design. So when people ask, why didn't collaboration last? Why did it always end in conflict? The answer is simple: because true collaboration requires equality. And equality was the one thing Europe could never afford to give. This isn't ancient history, it's a pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. If this made you think differently about history, leave your thoughts below. History isn't just about what happened, it's about why it was allowed to happen.